Today, AWWA is the largest, it's the oldest, and it's the preeminent water organization in the world. We all know that the American Water Works Association has a long, rich, and very proud history that stretches over 125 years. But have you ever wondered what brought those 22 men together in 1881 to form an organization that is now the largest and oldest water organization in the entire world? Well, to understand it, we have to look at the history of public health in North America. So let's think about the 1800s, the early 1800s. Between roughly 1820 and 1875 or so, three major cholera pandemics struck the world, killing millions of people. About in 1832, the first of those hit North America. And the death toll really will never be known because a lot of states destroyed their health records because they were afraid that the newly landed immigrants were going to be blamed for cholera and they'd be killed. The next outbreak hit the world in the 1850s. And in 1849, it actually started in the United States a little earlier. And unfortunately, that was the same time that people were going west to find gold, to find homes, to find new jobs. And they took cholera with them. The jumping off point for a lot of that westward expansion was St. Louis, Missouri. 10% of the population of St. Louis died within 3 months from cholera. Now in London, the impact hit in about 1854, and 57,000 people had died within about a week. One particular neighborhood in Soho was hit really, really hard. 500 people died in one day. It just so happens a young doctor named Dr. John Snow lived in that neighborhood. And he said, we've got to find a way to stop these continuing cholera outbreaks. So he launched an investigation of his own into what could possibly cause this. He plotted the deaths on a map. It's now called the ghost map. And he found that there was a pump called the Broad Street Pump that people were using from miles around because they liked the taste of that particular water. And he said, these deaths have got to be related to that pump because there was a brewery right next door. And none of the men that worked there ever got sick because they only drank what they produced, beer. Also, there was a prison camp about 2 blocks away. They had their own water supply, and none of them ever got ill. He also showed that people who sent for the water from miles away died as well. So he said, we've got to take this pump out of commission. And he talked the local city council into taking the pump handle off that pump. As a result, the waterborne epidemic stopped, and he wrote a treatise called On the Method of Communication of Cholera, saying that it's caused by fecal material in water that people then ingest and then they die. He was taken to task by Parliament and by the whole scientific community because the prevailing theory at the time was it was caused by bad air, miasma. And all people had to do was lock themselves up during an outbreak and all would be okay, but John Snow proved that that possibly couldn't happen. It wasn't until the next pandemic in the 1860s, and unfortunately Dr. Snow had died by that time, so he never got to see his theory proven, that in fact an independent scientific group in London summarized all the data and said it is caused by contaminated water. Shortly thereafter, they started cleaning up the Thames River, and the outbreak stopped in London. And the last outbreak in the United States was about 1877, but it was quickly replaced by another huge killer, typhoid fever. So this is kind of the environment that those men were living in that were running water utilities across the United States, and particularly in the Midwest, where they were using source waters from large rivers that were contaminated. And people were being more and more concerned about that's where our water's coming from. Water professionals were saying, look, we need to figure out between each other what's going on here. So let's jump forward to 1881. What a year 1881 was. 3 different men were in the White House because of an assassination. Billy the Kid broke out of jail, killed 2 deputies, and was later caught and shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett. Gunfight at the OK Corral. What an amazing year 1881 was. But we still didn't know what caused waterborne disease. So amidst all these exciting events in 1881, another event took place that didn't receive any notice whatsoever, but in the annals of public health history in the United States, it's probably one of the most important events in that year. That's when 22 men came together, Engineers Hall, Washington University, and St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, Missouri, remember? That's the city that lost 10% of its population in a cholera epidemic in 1849. So these 22 men sat down and said, we need a system where we can exchange information to deal with these problems. Now keep in mind, they did not know what caused disease at that time, either cholera, typhoid fever, any kind of those diseases. But they knew there was an issue with their source water. They knew it was contaminated, and they said, we need to do something about it. So we need to be able to talk to people in Iowa, in Kansas, in Illinois, and Kentucky to find out how are people dealing with these issues. That was the formation of the American Water Works Association. And guess what they did? Guess what their first action was? They formed a committee. Very true to AWWA form. They formed a committee, but it was probably the shortest-lived committee in AWWA history. Met overnight, and they wrote a constitution. That constitution passed the next day unanimously, and they said the purpose of this organization is to exchange information so that we can operate our water utilities better for the common good of the customer and of the water utilities, and to further efficient operations. It's important to note they put the customer first. That's what they were thinking of, that our customers, our consumers, our public being impacted by these diseases. We may not be at fault, but we need to do everything in our power to ensure that we're treating our water so that we can't be at fault. And that was the beginning of AWWA. The proceedings of that first conference are very interesting. They talked about source water pollution. They talked about poisoning of water by lead pipes. They talked about efficient fuel costs using corn cobs. So their scope was wide indeed. And if you look at the proceedings in the 1890s, you see source water pollution mentioned time and time and time again. And how do we treat water? How do we learn from the people in London? How do we learn from the people in France who are also facing these problems so that we can deal with them here in North America? And those proceedings have very rich papers in them about the early beginnings of public health protection in North America. As a matter of fact, in 1892, AWWA took its first government affairs action by sending a letter to Congress saying, we need a law to protect our source waters. Our source waters are being contaminated. We need a law to protect them. Now, by this time, the germ theory had been proven. That had been done in 1883, 1884 by Louis Pasteur and Robert Cook, who found the causative organism of cholera, Vibrio cholera. Later on, other researchers found the organism for typhoid fever. So by now we know the germ theory in the 1890s. And for that reason, they said, we need to do something about pollution. But they also said, we also need to treat the water more efficiently than we are today so that we can remove any organisms. In 1893, the association supported the government in passing the Interstate Quarantine Act. That act was designed to stop the transmission of disease across national lines and across state lines through buses and boats, interstate carriers they're called. And it gave the U.S. Public Health Service authority to regulate water, to regulate other environmental factors to ensure that people were not transmitting disease across state lines. And of course, quarantine was a major weapon that they were using in those days, particularly in ports. Let's take a look at 1900. It was really a turning point probably in public health history in the United States. At that point in time, the average lifespan in the U.S. was only 47 years of age. The infant mortality rate was 140 deaths per 1,000 live births, the highest in the world. The highest in the world. Obviously, public health professionals were alarmed. Water utility professionals were alarmed at these terrifying statistics. At the AWWA conference in 1901, George Warren Fuller gave a paper that showed that those cities that used groundwater or that used filtered surface water had a far less incident of disease than those who did not. In the next 8 years, 13 times the number of filtration plants were built in the U.S. than it ever existed before. The typhoid fever rate plummeted by 55%. AWWA had a huge role to play by making sure people had this information, the impact that filtration and, of course, disinfection with chlorine, which followed shortly thereafter, was having on disease rates. They could show, here's what's happening. We can save lives by investing in proper water treatment. In 1902, the U.S. Public Health Service passed the first drinking water regulation. It's interesting. What would you guess the first drinking water regulation would be? Well, actually, it was the banning of the common drinking water cup on trains, buses, and ships. That was the first drinking water regulation ever promulgated in the United States. Now, in 1914, the U.S. Public Health Service came back and said we need to regulate the amount of organisms in water. That's what's leading to waterborne disease. So they came out with what we can now call the coliform rule. And it's been relatively unchanged since 1914. So what was AWWA doing in these times? Well, at the turn of the century, AWWA had about 325 members and a whopping budget of $2,000. And there was such an international thirst for knowledge, and particularly for the proceedings of these meetings that AWWA was holding once a year, that they started selling them for $1 a proceedings. AWWA started to gain an international reputation as kind of the meeting place for information. If you wanted information, you could go to the AWWA annual meeting and see all the experts in water treatment from worldwide now gathering in one place to exchange information. Another momentous event happened in 1908. That's when AWWA adopted the very first standard. It was for cast iron pipe and fittings. One of the issues in all of water history has been getting pipes that would fit together. So if a pipe broke, you'd almost have to make an entirely new pipe because you never knew what the wall thickness was going to be or the opening was going to be, and you could never get a valve or a fire hydrant to fit. Back in the late 1800s, AWWA appointed the second committee to come up with this standard. So there was a standard that people could use. And that was finally adopted in 1908. And as we know now, AWWA has approximately 120, 140 standards for chemicals, for pipes, for other accoutrements that the industry needs in order to get water to the customer. And that was the beginning of AWWA standards, which probably is the one thing that AWWA is really known for worldwide. So in 1914, AWWA sat down and said, the men sat down and said, you know, there's such interest in what we're doing, we need a better way to get information out to localities. So they changed the Constitution to allow the formation of sections or local entities that would be under the broad umbrella of AWWA, but still could be then local means of communication. So all of a sudden, so much information started happening that people were saying, we need more than just once a year proceedings. So they started what they called the Journal of the American Water Works Association, and they published it 4 times a year. Demand kept going, demand kept going. So in 1919, they appointed an editor. His name, AWWA, probably the best known water figure in the history of public health. He said, we still have too much information. So by 1924, the American Water Works Association Journal was being published monthly. In 1920, another significant event happened. Because of the demand for standards, AWWA decided we need something permanent. We just can't use ad hoc committees to develop these various standards we all want. So they formed a standardization council in 1920, and shortly thereafter, that council published probably the only compendium of waterworks knowledge available at the time. It was called Waterworks Technology. 324 separate authors worked on it, and it was edited by AWWA. Today, that book is called Water Quality and Treatment. And it's the same. It puts together what we know about technology, what we know about water treatment, what we know about what people are doing in the field to conquer our problems. That started in 1920. In the 1930s, AWWA said to itself, we got too much going on here. We're volunteers. We have real jobs. We're out there on the front line stopping waterborne disease. We're doing research. We're teaching students. We're trying to come up with regulations in the states. We need something that's operating every day in our best interest. So they started talking about having an office somewhere, and they started talking about having a staff. So in about 1937, they started leasing space in New York City. As it turns out, New York was kind of the hub of engineering and scientific societies at that time. So it was natural that AWWA locate there. And they hired an executive secretary at the time. His name's Harry Jordan. He's become to be known as Mr. Water. He held the job for 22 years. And the staff in New York slowly grew as the demands upon the association became larger and larger. At the end of Mr. Jordan's tenure, in roughly 1959, typhoid fever had been wiped out of North America. AWWA had a very proud role to play in that because of just the sheer amount of energy, the sheer amount of information that AWWA provided, not just to its members, but to consumers, to government officials, to others about the importance of water treatment and wastewater treatment in order to prevent the spread of waterborne disease. Let's return to 1928 for just a moment because a very important event happened. Up until this time, both the water and the wastewater professionals were sitting down together and dealing with issues together, and all of a sudden they realized, look, we've got too much on our plate. There's special cases in the wastewater field that really need some attention. Obviously, the drinking water field has special cases that really need attention and focus. As a result, AWWA helped establish a new organization. It's called the Sewage Works Federation at that time. It's today called the Water Environment Federation. It was felt that because each field had so much to do, it was very important to focus the professionals in each field on those particular issues, but with a close working relationship. And that relationship between the water and the wastewater professionals still exists today, because obviously it's critical for those two groups to work very, very closely together, because water is truly linked, and you can't deal with one without dealing with the other one and still protect public health. During the 30s, during the 40s, a huge growth in the number of sections of AWWA, and it's important to note that during both World Wars I and II, the association provided valuable information to the military. Many members were in the military at the time, and as a result, safe water was being able to be delivered to the men fighting in the field. Without that, waterborne disease may have taken a huge toll of fighting men on both sides, and as a result, waterborne disease wasn't an issue in either of the two world wars. After World War II, AWWA really blossomed in growth because people were returning home. There was a huge demand for housing. There's a huge demand for jobs, a huge demand for industry to gear back up for the domestic economy, and as a result, water was needed everywhere. So clearly the water profession came to its own in the 50s and the 60s, and obviously on until today. During that time, AWWA really expanded in terms of the amount of information being provided and the amount of events that were being produced and the amount of materials. The publications went from the journal to 5 different publications all of a sudden, just because of the constant demand for information. And going beyond the technology of water, going into how do we administer a water utility? How do we finance it? What's public relations? What's that all about? In the 60s, a couple events happened that were critical. One was in 1966, because of the realization that technology was going to explode, or had to explode, the association formed the Research Foundation, first as a part of AWWA and then later, the next year, as a separate organization so that it could raise money more effectively. Today, that organization is a very, very successful independent organization that funds about $30 million worth of research a year, far more than the federal government is funding right now. Another thing happened. Water utilities said, you know, we need a voice. We need a voice in Washington. We need a voice in our state legislatures. We need a group that will be our voice. So they formed the Water Utility Council. And that council today, obviously, is the government voice of the American Water Works Association. So a Washington office was established. First, it was just one person, and that now has grown to 9 people in Washington, D.C., to help the Water Utility Council interact with the various government agencies, particularly the Environmental Protection Agency. Back in the 1980s, the Safe Drinking Water Act was reauthorized. Those amendments were particularly harsh. Not only harsh, impossible to implement. As a result, the American Water Works Association, the National Association of Water Companies, which represents the investor-owned field, the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, which represents the very large water utilities, the National Rural Water Association, that represents the very small utilities. So they formed the Water Industry Coordinating Committee, which exists today. They also formed the Water Industry Technical Action Fund, which you probably know as WITAF. And very, very important studies have done on infrastructure. In fact, the leading study on infrastructure, the Donald Replacement Area, was funded by WITAF. And that study is still being quoted today by Congress and by others as probably the seminal study on infrastructure needs in the United States. In 1991, the association said, look, we've been able to control waterborne disease in North America through our joint efforts, and more than just waterborne disease. We've been able to educate consumers. We've been able to conserve water. We've been able to find new sources of water, new technologies through this joint effort of the American Water Works Association and the other professional groups. There's a huge need worldwide for this same information. It's interesting, and we don't know this because these people don't have a voice, but 10,000 people die every day from waterborne disease. Not in North America, obviously in the developing countries. AWWA said we have to be their voice. So they formed another organization called Water for People. Water for People is now a very vibrant organization on its own, independent organization, providing technical assistance, providing funds to village-level water treatment projects so that the poorest of the poor aren't denied safe drinking water. As we look back at the legacy of the American Water Works Association, we can be very proud as AWWA members. AWWA has done its very best for not just the profession, but for the public at large. It's interesting to note that today the average age lifespan is 77 years of age. The infant mortality rate is now down below 6 per 1,000 live births. And the Centers for Disease Control a couple years ago said, look, the major reason for that is safe drinking water. AWWA can take pride in the fact that they had a huge role to play in providing that safe drinking water in that period of time. So as we deal with the many issues facing us as water professionals and as the American Water Works Association, we can never forget the legacy started by those 22 men in 1881 in St. Louis.